Chapter 2, The Chemistry of Life. All right, this is our first recording. Today we're going to talk about the first section in Chapter 2 that we'll be covering, which is going to be 2.3. Now, the first two sections of Chapter 2 I'm not going to cover in class, but I still would encourage you to go ahead and read them just so you have the information in your head. I won't be testing you over it, but it wouldn't hurt you to go ahead and just read those first two sections. They're not very long. All right, so section 2.3 talks about the atom carbon. Carbon is essential for life on Earth. Pretty much every living thing is what we call a carbon-based organism. That means these organisms are built from molecules that have carbon as their central structure. Carbon makes a really good atom for creating building materials because it has this ability to create 4 covalent bonds. A covalent bond is just a bond where one atom is going to share its electrons with the atom beside it. So in this picture down here you can see we've got all these carbons. In this case they're in a chain, and each of these little lines represents a bond. So this carbon is holding on to 2 hydrogen atoms as well as 2 other carbon atoms. So each line represents a place where an electron is going to be shared between these 2 atoms. So, like I said, carbon makes really good structural molecules. The reason for that is because it can make a variety of different shapes. In this case, we can see it makes a straight chain. It can also make branching structures as well as ring structures. This versatility of carbon makes it an excellent atom to be the base, the skeleton of a lot of our molecules. Now, when you look at, say, that carbon ring, here's an example of a carbon ring right here. Each of these points represents one carbon atom. This structure can bond to another carbon ring or to another type of carbon molecule. When we're looking at this sort of a big molecule here that is made from a bunch of smaller repeating subunits, we call this a polymer. Poly means many. So this large molecule is made from many smaller subunits. Each of the smaller subunits is called a monomer. Mono meaning one. So this is one of the little carbon-based compounds in the larger polymer. This is just 2 vocabulary words that I'm going to be using in this unit, so you need to be familiar with them. Now, carbon is so important to biology because it is the basis of living things. Biology is obviously the study of life, and so it's important to us to understand what molecules carbon can make in living things. And there are 4 primary ones that we're going to look at: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Now, what's interesting about these molecules and what's so important about them is the fact that all living things on the planet are made from these 4 biomolecules. Everything, from bacteria to humans to plants, all living things have these same 4 biomolecules in them. That shows a common ancestry to all living things on Earth. That's important. That's significant in the study of biology, so understanding these molecules as the foundational molecules of living things is also important in biology. So we're going to take a look at each of these biomolecules in turn. The first one we'll talk about are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are basically sugars, just different sizes of sugars. If we're going to look at the smallest kind of a carbohydrate, we call that a monosaccharide. Saccharide means sugar. Mono, like we already learned, means one. So this is just a simple little single sugar, something like a fructose found in fruit or a glucose that plants create. These are monosaccharides. If you take 2 monosaccharides and hook them together, you get a disaccharide. Di meaning 2, saccharide meaning sugar. So it's 2 of these little simple monosaccharides hooked together. Table sugar would be a good example of that. Polysaccharide. This is going to be a bunch of monosaccharides all hooked together. This is much larger and much more complex. So we consider a poly, which is many, saccharide, to be a polymer of monosaccharides. Okay, 2 vocabulary words here. A polymer, let's go back, is a long chain of repeating subunits. So it's simply a bunch of sugars all stuck together. Something like a starch, a glucagon, or a cellulose. Those are examples of larger, more complex carbohydrates that we would classify as a polysaccharide. So here's an example of your basic carbohydrates. The cake would be a carbohydrate. The sugar that she's sprinkling on top of it would be a simple disaccharide. What determines the kind of carbohydrate you're looking at is the type of monomer that goes into the construction of it, as well as how those monomers are going to be bonded together. In this example, these monomers are bonded together very simply by little bonds. There's no branches, it's nice and straight. Not all carbohydrates are built that way. And I'm not going to expect you to memorize chemical structures, so please don't look at these things or on the previous slide with the shapes of the carbon-based molecules. You don't have to memorize that stuff, but just understand that how they're put together determines what kind of carbohydrate they are. So we can use carbohydrates as a source of energy. They're very important to eat. Carbohydrates get a bad reputation in the press. People say don't eat carbs because they'll make you fat. Well, they don't. What makes you fat is if you eat too many carbs. You don't have to have a mountain of spaghetti on your plate, but you do have to have carbohydrates in your diet because they are the primary source of energy for humans. So they are important. Some carbohydrates have structural properties, such as these two down here. And these are just two examples that I'm showing you. One of them is starch, and these are both found in plants. Starch is a polymer. It's made from a repeating subunit of little glucose molecules. But notice how they're bonded together. This one is in a branching form. This is the exact same stuff, the same building material, but this polymer is called cellulose. The monomers are bonded together in a different way. That gives cellulose different properties. You can digest starch, like potatoes or bread, very easily, but you cannot digest cellulose. Even though it's made from the same material, the way it's bonded affects its properties. All right, let's move on to our next biomolecule. Lipids. Lipids are things like fats and oils and cholesterol. They basically come in two varieties. We've got the saturated and the unsaturated varieties. Don't try to memorize this sort of an image. You do not have to know this. This is just an example so you can see how a saturated lipid, which is made from fatty acids, has the carbon backbone. In this case, it's a chain, not a ring. But notice how each of these carbons has hydrogen hooked to it. It's holding on to a hydrogen at every single point. This one is an unsaturated fatty acid. Now follow the carbons. As you go through, you find some that aren't holding on to a hydrogen. All saturated and unsaturated means is that this carbon down here, this carbon chain, is unsaturated with hydrogens, meaning it's not holding on to all the hydrogen that it possibly could. In the end, that changes its shape. This fatty acid chain will be nice and straight and smooth because it's well balanced. This fatty acid chain, because some of the carbons are not holding on to hydrogen, they're double bonded to another carbon, this guy is going to be kinked or crooked in its structure. And that'll affect how it appears when you get a bunch of them all together. So we use lipids in a couple different ways. They can be broken down as an energy source. For humans, it's not our primary source of energy. We rely on carbohydrates mostly. We use lipids to make cell membranes, and so they are important. You can't have a diet that is completely deplete of lipids. You have to have some lipids in your diet in order to make those cell membranes and to help make hormones in your body. So they are still important. Even though you don't need a whole lot of them, you do have to have some. Those cell membranes are central to life on Earth. If we don't have a cell membrane, then we don't have a cell. And so we have to understand the phospholipid. This is that very special lipid that cell membranes are made of. And we will talk more about the phospholipid when we get to our chapter on cells. But I want you to have a basic understanding of their composition. They have three main parts. They have a phosphate head, which in this very, very simplified drawing, this is the phosphate head. There's a glycerol, which isn't shown here, but it's just right in the middle. And then there are two fatty acid tails. And here you can see those represented by these squiggly lines. This particular molecule, this phospholipid, has properties that make it a wonderful building material for cell membranes. This phosphate head is what is called polar, meaning it likes to be near water. These fatty acid tails are nonpolar, and they don't like to be near water. So when you get a bunch of them together, like we can see in this diagram, and this is a basic cell membrane, here you can see the phosphate head on one side and the fatty acid tails hanging down in the middle. We get this very specific structure that creates our cell membranes, and we'll talk more about that later. All right, our next biomolecule is going to be proteins. Proteins are made from a long chain of amino acids. So proteins are polymers made from the monomer amino acid. These are the little things that hook together in a chain to make a protein. All amino acids have this wonderful shape down here. You don't have to memorize this. What I want you to know is that an amino acid has a central carbon, and hooked to that central carbon are 4 groups. The groups are the amino group, the carboxyl group, the hydrogen group, and then this one. This is what I want you to know, the R group. Every amino acid has this same basic structure down here in black. But the part that's different in the 21 different amino acids that we have is this R group up here. In the simplest amino acid, this R group is made of just a single hydrogen atom. In the largest, most complex amino acid, this R group is a huge collection of atoms that makes it very complex. You don't have to memorize what they are, just understand that what makes one amino acid different from another is whatever atoms are bonded right here in this location. So if we take a bunch of amino acids and hook them together in a chain, we get a protein. So here you can see the blue dot represents one amino acid. Here's the next amino acid in the chain and the next one. You don't have to memorize this structure here. Don't worry about this. Just notice that when one amino acid bonds to the next one, they're bonded together with what is called a peptide bond. A peptide bond holds 2 amino acids together. So if I take a bunch of amino acids and hook them together with peptide bonds, I get something called a poly, meaning many, peptide. Polypeptide is just a protein, a chain of amino acids. Now, what's going to give a protein its particular properties are what amino acids are hooked together in this chain. Remember, there's over 20 different amino acids, so the order that they come in determines the structure and the function of this protein. Look at this chain of amino acids here. Each of these little red dots represents an amino acid. They're all hooked together, but it's not a straight chain. It turns and it bends and it looks like it's bonding to itself, and it makes this unique 3-dimensional structure. That's what happens with a chain of amino acids. When they come together, they interact with each other. Sometimes they pull together like magnets, creating little hydrogen bonds between them. Other times they repel each other, like this one is really far away from that one. They don't seem to want to be close together. Every chain of amino acids will make a very unique and specific 3-dimensional shape. Proteins are shape-based molecules. Shape is everything. The shape of a protein is what allows it to do its job. If it does not have the proper shape, an amino acid cannot function. This particular one happens to be the hemoglobin protein, or at least one of them. This is something that you find in your blood. It helps carry oxygen to your cells. If one of these amino acids was wrong, let's say that this one right here was mutated, and it was the wrong amino acid, well, that would give it different properties, and this portion would not come together the way it is here. So this whole structure would have a different shape. If it doesn't have the right shape, it can't work, and this hemoglobin protein would be useless. So the sequence of the amino acids is very, very important to determine what function the protein as a whole can perform. All right, here's our last biomolecule, nucleic acids. Using our vocab term, a nucleic acid is a polymer made of the monomers called nucleotides. Each chain of nucleic acids are created from individual little monomers that look like this. They have a sugar base, so this sugar is deoxyribose. To the sugar is hooked a phosphate group as well as a base group. Now this base group comes in 4 basic varieties, T, G, A, and C, and we'll talk about those more later. But this nucleotide is the monomer that when they hook together in a chain, like this one, here's one monomer, there's the next monomer, and they all hook together, we get a polymer. This polymer is called a nucleic acid. In this case, it's DNA. DNA has the primary function to store information, and that really is pretty much all it can do. There is another kind of nucleic acid called RNA. It has more versatility. It's able to assemble molecules. It's able to speed up or catalyze chemical reactions. It's similar to DNA in that it's made of the nucleotide monomer, but it has a couple different properties to it, and we'll talk more about these when we get to our section on genetics. All right, that is it for Chapter 2, Section 2.3.